All right, everybody. Good evening, Democrats.
Good evening, Democrats. Really
Thank you,
alone?
Melissa. I see some.
I was like, alone? I did that alone?
Let's do everyone. Let's unmute for a second. Just, get it going here. Okay. 3, 2, 1. Good evening, Democrats.
Good evening, Democrats.
Okay, perfect. Now we'll mute everybody again. Okay, welcome to our February membership meeting. For those who don't know already, we have Suzanne, our excellent live interpreter. She's here. Suzanne, did you want to say hello really quick? Or maybe, is it? Okay, well, she's here. If you should be able to switch over. She may be already interpreting, but you can go down in the bottom of the screen where it says interpretation, and you can click on listen in Spanish if Spanish is your preferred language. And Helen, maybe next time we'll get a German interpreter for you. But you can feel free to switch over and listen to that. We're glad to have her back. So thanks everybody for joining us here instead of the special city council meeting on the housing element. I know I personally have the meeting recording on my VCR, and I'll go back and watch the VHS tape later tonight. Dan, I don't know if you know what a VHS tape is. I'll tell you later. Okay, so anyway, in a few minutes, we'll begin our presentation on Rent Control 101. Before we get to that, we do have a few brief announcements. First announcement, we have the results in for our AD 51 ADEM elections. And let me pull that up really quick. Sharing my screen here. So everybody in green won a seat on our ADEM on our delegate spots. So you can see that the highest vote getter in the district was Carolyn Terosas, who's currently in the council meeting. And also from our executive committee of this club, Isabel Story and Dan Hall. And there's some other familiar names here who some of you may know who are going to be joining the California Democratic Party as delegates. So for those who are new to the local politics, this is the election where Democrats in each district voted to determine which activists will be representing our region in the California Democratic Party. So we want to congratulate all of the winners. Like I said, Isabel, Dan, who are members of our board, Councilmember Carolyn Terosas, who's in the council meeting, couldn't be here, but she's going to be representing us not only as a delegate, but also as a member of the state party's executive board, which means that she gets to represent us among a smaller group of party leaders and attend even more meetings throughout the year, which I'm sure she's absolutely thrilled about the opportunity to do. Speaking of elections, next month on March 29th, we have our annual executive committee election for the club's leadership team. I'm going to go to speaker view so everyone can see me better. Okay, so anyone who joins the club no later than March 27th is eligible to vote in that, February 27th is eligible to vote in that election. So please be sure to join soon in the next few days if you're not yet a club member, or if you were a member in 2022, you just have to renew right before that March 29th meeting in order to be able to vote. Any questions about your membership status? If you're not sure if you renewed in 2023 yet or not, just check in with our Vice President of Membership, Michael Soloff, who's here on this call. You can see him in one of the squares. Additionally, you have until the same date of February 27th, next Monday, if you want to nominate yourself to run in the election to be on our executive committee. So far, we've had 3 people who've come forward to express interest. But if you're interested in running yourself, please reach out to either me or one of the other incumbent board members who are co-hosts here in this meeting. let us know that you're interested and we'll gladly include you in that process. Also, at next month's meeting, we have our legislative committee presentation regarding a series of bills that this club will be considering for endorsement. So our legislative committee is already hard at work preparing for this meeting, and I'll turn it over to our Vice President of Legislation, Isabel Story, for a quick preview on what to expect next month.
Oh, thanks, John. Yeah, we really got a head start on it this year, and we've already had 2 meetings of the legislative committee and have considered a number of bills and have already approved 7, which we forwarded on to the exec board. So you'll be hearing about those at the March meeting. And then in between time, since it's such a busy time for our committee right now and for legislation in California, we have 2 more meetings of our committee scheduled, February 27th and March 5th. Let's see, I was going to copy and paste that into the chat so you can see. So if you're interested in attending those, you can just reach out to me. I'm going to put my email there. And yeah, I was just going to tell you, it's a very busy legislative season. The deadline for the state legislators to submit bills was last Friday. So there were a record 2,600 bills submitted. And we read every single one. No, I'm just kidding. We were able to trust our coalition partners and advisors and people we have contacts with to help guide us to the most important bills. And we've thoroughly looked at these, evaluated them, sent them to the board. So as I said, we've already vetted 7, and we have about the same number to consider over the next 2 meetings. But I was just going to read you some of the topics, because these bills are things that really affect us all, from campaign reform, getting money out of politics, tax on extreme wealth, affordable housing, artificial intelligence, which you might have been hearing about in the news. It's just advancing by leaps and bounds, and equally important topics coming up. And how I feel about it is our club is really active with campaigning and getting people elected, which is great. But then once they're elected, what do they do? And that's what the legislative committee is looking at. Are they following through on their campaign promises? And also, how can we help them? Sometimes, certain bills are a shoo-in, but many times they have a hard battle. And so they need our advocacy. And then, as John mentioned, March 29th, the general meeting is going to be all about legislation. So we're going to present these bills to you, the membership, to vote on whether you would like to endorse these. And if you do, we're going to be advocating for them with the legislature. When we can also kill bills that we think are really bad. So that's a possible action. So we will be talking about that. And at that meeting, I'm also going to give you just an introduction to legislation, how the bills become law, and how to advocate. If you're really for something or you're against something, how do you make your voice heard? We can make our voice heard as a club, but you can also do it as an individual. So just to demystify that process for you. So a lot to look forward to. And I guess that's it for now, John.
Thanks so much, Isabel. Looking forward to that next month. So everybody be sure to come on March 29th. We'll be hearing from Isabel, from the committee, from these legislators, getting to work on this important advocacy work, which we implemented into our bylaws last year, that we wanted to make sure that this legislative advocacy was a core principle for the club. So we're really glad to be able to be doing that. Okay. Also, at next month's meeting, we have, I said that already. Next, we want to remind everybody that we're currently working toward bringing us back to in-person meetings later this year. And so in order to do that, we're working on finding a new location to hold our meetings, because the libraries now close much earlier than they used to. So we can't stay there until 9. So as well as a means to host the hybrid meetings. So with an update is our Vice President of Programs, Melissa Goodman.
Hi, everyone. I just wanted to put it in a pitch, and I'm going to put this in the chat. I'm going to have a meeting of interested folks, hopefully sometime next week. It will probably, be a meeting or two to brainstorm and think about best locations and best ways to really have effective and inclusive hybrid meetings. So I put my email in the chat. If you are interested, oh, and there's a typo in it, which is really helpful, but I'll fix that in a minute. If you're interested in helping us think through where or how to do that best to make the most meaningful and good experience for people in person and also joining at home, we want to do it really well. Please reach out to me and join that committee. You don't have to do everything for programs, just this piece about hybrid. And even if you don't want to join the committee, I'm very open to emails that suggest places maybe where you've done or participated in an effective hybrid meeting. We're looking for places that could be open Wednesday nights, have very stable Wi-Fi. If you have tech experience of pulling off hybrid meetings, we could particularly use that. So please reach out to me if you are interested, and I will fix the typo in my email now. Thanks.
Great. Thanks so much, Melissa. So everyone reach out to Melissa if you have anything to say about how to do hybrid meetings, where we should do them, your own thoughts as somebody, experiencing the meetings and what might be helpful for those. Okay, last bit before we get to the main topic of the meeting, looking at the national scene, we had some news last night. Wisconsin held their state primary. There's going to be a few governor's races in November, as well as some special elections, of course. I personally am hoping for one in George Santos's district, but we'll see if that happens or not. But the Wisconsin Supreme Court race has the potential to be the most significant election of 2023. So the reason I say that is because the result of this Supreme Court race will determine the balance of power in the Wisconsin State Supreme Court for the next 2 years, meaning that the administration of the 2024 presidential election and whether or not we have a fair election in Wisconsin next year depends on this outcome. So even though we like to think of Wisconsin as a lean blue state, as we saw in 2020, it doesn't always go that way. And just in time for this, I see that our very own Wisconsin native of the Santa Monica Democratic Club, Susan Shu, just joined the meeting. So we're throwing her right into it. Susan, thanks for being here. And did you want to just sort of give us a little bit of a background on what happened last night and why this election is so important?
Thank you. I'm so sorry. I was having technical difficulties because I've been rushing around talking about Wisconsin all day with other people as well. So last night was great. I don't know how nerdy you all are, but I assume pretty nerdy. So there were, Wisconsin has a jungle primary, sort of like we do. And yesterday's election was between 4 candidates, 2 MAGA, election denying nightmares of people, one worse than the other. And the worst one won on the Republican side. And we had 2 good Democrats running, and the really good, really sustainable one who's well-funded won is Judge Janet. And I cannot pronounce her last name, which is a very complicated Polish last name, but you can just remember her as Janet Pro-Choiceowicz. It's like pro something witch, but just think of it as pro-choiceowicz, because the importance, I think you all know, because it's been such an interesting, important race for being like a little race on this tiny little part of the American chessboard. But it is really important, and it's actually going to be a very expensive race because well, I'll get into that in a minute, but Janet won, and she's the best qualified to be a justice right from the get-go. She won about 46.5% of the vote that's been counted so far, and both of the MAGA people won about 22.5 or 23% of the vote. So if you add their percentages together, they don't quite meet hers. Like she surpassed, which is awesome news. But the bad news is that everybody us because we care so much, and then people who are really just devoted to turning the whole country into a fascist nightmare are also very much focused on this. So people like the Uline family in Wisconsin, who are kind of like the Koch brothers of Wisconsin, but they own this packaging box company that's multimillionaires, and the Koch brothers themselves, and then people like the DeVosses are funding the opposition candidate. His name is Daniel. I forgot what his name is, but he's the point is that the guy who's running against Judge Janet he has been as recently as 2020 a justice on the Wisconsin Supreme Court, and he lost his seat because he sucks, but he's now trying to get his seat back again, and he's got a lot of financial backing. And as recently as December of 2022, he's been taking money directly from dark money, election denying people at very high levels in the United States. So he must be defeated. And whereas the numbers yesterday make it look like it's a slam dunk, it's totally not a slam dunk. Like, every vote will be very important. So I hope that everybody who has 20 minutes or more and $10 or more can donate either their time or money or both to some phone banking and some donations. I'm actually holding an event this weekend for the Wisconsin Dems. I'm from Wisconsin, so if anyone wants to buy a ticket, the tickets are $100 and up. Our special guest is Tammy Baldwin. But I want to highlight again why everyone in America who cares deeply about civics and human rights and, you know, our democracy is into this race. There was a state law in California or in Wisconsin that was immediately triggered when Roe versus Wade fell, and it was an 1849 abortion ban in Wisconsin. And it's crazy that we're even talking about laws from 1849, because what is this, the freaking Bible or something, you know, like the Old Testament? But anyway, because of the gerrymandered supermajority in the Wisconsin state legislature, they took that opportunity to immediately roll back all reproductive rights protections for women and girls in Wisconsin right away last summer. So this is a nonpartisan position, but it's now kind of crazy versus non-crazy. And Judge Janet is a pro-choice woman who has committed to using her vote to turn back that 1849 abortion ban. And importantly, for the whole country, including us, she's also committed to using her vote to ungerrymander the maps that have been so deeply partisan and red, that give a very small, a small plurality of voters in Wisconsin who are Republican voters an outsized voice on the state legislature. It's really the only reason Wisconsin's, you know, halfway okay right now and is always in danger is because of Governor Tony Evers' veto pen. So I encourage everyone who has any resources of any kind to give it their all between now and April 4th, which is Wisconsin's election. So anyway, John, take it away. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susan. And so for all of those reasons, it's now time to relaunch our club's phone banking efforts, which we've put on hold since November. People have had the chance to take a few weeks off, but we're going to release the details of this in the next couple of weeks, exactly the when and everything. But we are going to be holding in-person phone banks at the home of Michael Soloff to call Wisconsin voters and make sure we keep the Wisconsin Supreme Court in Democratic control. So everybody who's on this is probably already on our email list. If you're not, if you're watching on YouTube or something, go to our website, sign up for the email list on the right side column so that you can get the latest news about the club. And that's going to include the phone banking opportunities. We want to make sure that we have as many people as possible. If you have no idea how to phone bank, you can come to the meetings and we will train you live at the meeting on how to do it. And we're really looking forward to getting back to phone banking wherever we can. We've done it in California. We've done it for Arizona. We've done it for Nevada. We've done it for all these other states. Now we're going to take our efforts to Wisconsin and keep this Supreme Court in Democratic control. Okay, let's shift gears to tonight's meeting. The topic of this meeting is Rent Control 101. We're going to hear from all 5 members of our rent control board, as well as additional rent control experts this evening, who are each going to be presenting on separate pieces of the nuts and bolts information on how rent control works in Santa Monica, as well as the history of our rent control law and how it benefits our community. We're calling it Rent Control 101 because this meeting is going to be structured a little bit more like a lecture series than our usual conversational, interactive question and answer meeting format. So we've asked these guests here to present information about rent control and to inform our members about this topic on a policy level, rather than to have a back and forth conversation or a debate about rent control as a political issue. So in the future, if there's any need for political action on this topic by this club, such as a ballot measure or some other reason why we need to take political action as a Democratic club, we will agendize a more robust back and forth discussion and debate about those potential actions and positions. So tonight, we would just want to give everybody the opportunity to get up to speed about rent control as a policy, as the law that exists here in Santa Monica. So with that said, let's get started. And I'm pleased to welcome our Rent Control Board Chair, who's been an outstanding leader and tireless advocate for tenants' rights, who has consistently demonstrated a deep understanding of the challenges faced by renters in Santa Monica, and has been a strong advocate for policies that can help address these challenges. Please welcome Chair Anastasia Foster.
Well, hello and good evening. Are you guys going to start the slideshow? All right, whenever you're ready. First of all, just while they're doing that, I'll say thank you so very much to the Santa Monica Democratic Club for inviting. Oh, wait, I don't want to see the whole thing here. There we go. Thank you so much for inviting the Rent Board to present on the charter that's been entrusted to the care of our agency. My name is Anastasia Foster, and I'm a renter. And now in my 16th year in Santa Monica and my 7th year of service, I'm proud to have been endorsed by this body in both of my elections for Rent Board, as were my current colleagues. We've welcomed 4 new members in the last few months, and you will hear from them all here tonight. Vice Chair Erica Leslie, Kurt Gonska, Danny Ivanoff, and Lonnie Gwynn. So we're here tonight to educate and to inform. There's been a lot of interest in rent control as of late, and with the rampant inflation that has hopefully only temporarily blown the prices up that configure our general adjustment, we wanted to take the time to share with all of you some of the more important aspects of our law. Now, Santa Monica voters overwhelmingly supported Measure RC in November, which lowered the maximum general adjustment to 3% or less. We joined, I believe, all of the other rent control jurisdictions in the state in lowering our maximum. We're now receiving about 50 calls per day down at the Rent Board agency, down from around 150 calls a day from both tenants and landlords trying to get their calculations just exactly right. And that's what we want you to do. If you have any questions about what your rent level should be as of February 1st, please don't hesitate to call the board office and you will be assisted. We'll have all that contact info for you here on the meeting. Now, the next newsletter will be going out to tenants and property owners around March 17th. Be sure to watch your mailboxes. Don't let it hit the recycle bin before you've read it, because staying informed about the law that governs the roof over our heads is the responsibility of all of us. We have lots of great stuff at the agency. We have a free and available tenant seminars and owner seminars. They switch between daytime and evening. They're recorded and made available on our websites. The next tenant seminar will be April 4th virtually, and the next owner seminar will be April 5th. The public is invited to attend if you sign up. So see our website for more on things like that, programming like that. So on with the show. What is rent control? Rent control is a policy enacted by the voters of Santa Monica in 1979 to control how high and how quickly rents can rise after your first year of tenancy. The first of its kind in California. It's been tested in the courts and at the ballot box a lot, and it has stood the test of time and been shaped and refined into the law we have today by these processes. But it might be easier to explain what rent control is by telling you what it's not. Rent control is not low income or technically even affordable housing by its very definition. Rent control is not a voucher program. Rent control is not for any one person. A friend described it to me recently as agnostic, in that it does not matter who exactly is in one of our 27,000 plus units of rent controlled housing. Rent control is a veil draped over an entire community. Rent control is a way to ensure predictability and stability in the costs of living for a community and for a renter at every unit price point and at any and every income level. Rent control is a way for 70% of our front doors in this city to be lived in by neighbors and not folks just passing through. The stability of our schools, our parks, our budget, and our civic organizations of every kind depends on it. Since Costa-Hawkins was enacted here 24 years ago, you see a wide range of prices, which now rank as some of the highest rents for a vacant unit in the entire nation. So that's it. That's the intro. Let's dive in, hear from the other commissioners, and take a closer look at some of the details of our law and the services of our Rent Control Board agency. I'll be back at the end to wrap things up. Thank you, and I'll toss it first to my colleague, Commissioner Lonnie Gwynn.
Great. Thank you, Anastasia. Oops. So I think Lonnie is
Lonnie should be in.
here. Okay, great. Hey, Lonnie.
Hello.
So thank you, Anastasia. For our next section, we're going to welcome our newest Rent Control Board Commissioner, Lonnie Gwynn, who was appointed earlier this year to fill the vacancy left by Councilmember Torosis. And so, Lonnie, before you begin your presentation, we typically welcome all of our new public officials to introduce themselves to the club right away, but we knew you'd be here within a few weeks tonight anyway for this presentation. So I want to just welcome you to just please tell us about yourself personally and your background before you dive into the agency processes section of your presentation.
Oh, sure. Well, I'm a Midwestern transfer, moved to LA some 20 years ago, and started working for the city back in 2009, I believe it was. Came from Rand Corporation. I worked with the library and then went to economic development. And then for 9 years, I was a Rent Control Board employee. I was the office coordinator and also the board secretary. So I think that gives me a unique perspective in for the board, because as a board member, as far as we know, I'm the first person that's ever gone from being an employee of the Rent Control Board to actually serving on the Rent Control Board. My background, I have a degree in mass communications with a business major, and so I've used that in any number of different fields that I've served in before, for anywhere from a sports editor from a regional newspaper to being a mail carrier for the post office. So I've had a lot of unique background things that I think can be used for this. And I just want to thank everybody that supported me as I look to be appointed to this position, because I certainly take it seriously and look forward to being able to offer my unique background as a person on the operational side of the Rent Control Board, which very few commissioners get the chance to actually see face to face. So that's kind of my background. So I'll dive into my section of this. I'm going to be talking about the operational side of rent control. And just a second here, I'm going to do this a little different here. I lost my I need to get my notes I had up on the screen, and now I've lost them. Let me pull them up on my phone. I'm sorry about that. I didn't realize when
We've
we
all
went to
been
pull.
there, Lonnie. It's okay.
Yeah, I'm gonna pull them up here because I've got them right here, just in case there's one wrong here. All right, here we go. So I'm gonna speak to the operational side. There we go. Now I can see it, of the rent control board. And typically we call the operational side the agency, just to kind of delineate between the rent control board and the operations of the board. So when I talk about the agency tonight, I'm talking about the operational side. And of course, I come from that side as a former employee. The rent control board actually only hires 2 individuals on our on the operational side, and that's the executive director, who is currently Tracy Condon, and the general counsel, currently Alice Regan. Every other employee on the 25 of the 25 employees are hired by those 2 people. So there's no direct link between the rent control board and the employees, other than the executive director and the general counsel. The unusual thing about the rent control board is that we are separate from the city. It doesn't seem like it in many ways, because we're certainly intertwined with the city. We're in City Hall and we use city services like HR and finance. And we do pay for all those services. We reimburse the city for those services. The separateness of the board is actually delineated in the charter for the city. And because that is so important, I want to read that sentence word for word in section 1802. The rent control board shall be an integral part of the government of the city, but shall exercise its powers and duties under this article independent of and without interference from the city council, city manager, and city attorney. So in addition to being separate in that way, we also have our own budget. And again, the city charter sets up how we get our revenue, in that it's from revenue from registration fees. And this will be the last part I read word from the charter, but I think it is important as well. The board shall finance its reasonable and necessary expenses by charging landlords annual registration fees in amounts deemed reasonable by the board, up to a maximum of $288 per controlled unit. Currently, it's $228 per controlled unit that we charge in the city. That can be changed from year to year by the board as they see necessary. And the charter also shows that the landlord, if they pay their fees on time, can actually pass through half of that fee to their tenant. And the good thing about the revenue coming from registration fees alone is that we don't use any city taxes and we don't use any general fund money. It all comes from those registration fees. Now, over the years, we've had a lot of pushback from landlords saying, well, we shouldn't have to pay any of that fee because we get no benefit from it. But there's a lot of arguments against that. But by the law, the landlords are responsible for paying that fee, and the law affects both the tenants and the landlords. So therefore, the agency serves both tenants and landlords. Over the years, it's been fairly consistent in the percentage of communications we have between landlords and tenants in the agency, and that includes email, phone, in person. It's been around 39% of our calls have been from landlords, about 55% from tenants. However, you have to realize there's over 27,000 tenants and there's less than 4,000 landlords. So it appears that a very higher percentage of landlords use our services than actually percentage of tenants. I next want to kind of dive into the organization and what the agency does. I'm going to go over each of the 4 divisions in the agency, but 2 of them briefly because they're not really so much seen by the public. And I think that's more what we want to talk about here tonight. The first is administration, which is mostly support for the board members and for the agency. It includes Executive Director Condon, but it also includes the board secretary, the billings people, the staff assistants, oversight, budget oversight people, and also the people that oversight the database. The second one is legal. That includes our attorneys. And it's important to note that our attorneys do not represent tenants. They represent the board in legal matters, whether it's against the board or instigated by the board. I don't want to underplay those 2 divisions because they obviously are extremely important. But the next two ones are the ones that the public interacts with. The first is public information. And I feel that they're the true face of rent control, because almost every single communication that comes into either board or agency starts with our public information people. Like all attorneys on our staff, the public information people know the rent control law inside and out. And that's not just local law, but also state and regional laws that affect our rent control. Because of their extensive knowledge, they hold numerous seminars over the year to educate landlords and tenants. And they also put together a very extensive annual report that's required by the charter. And that will actually be coming out in the next month or so for 2022. To give you an idea how many contacts our public information people handle, in 2022, they had over 13,000 contacts, which averaged out to about 52 per day that we were open. That can waver from time to time. For example, Measure RC was fairly complex when it was put into place. And so there's been a lot of questions about that. So our daily contacts have gone from 52 to up to 87 since the beginning of this year. And we do that with the same number of staff. So it's a busy time of the year right now. In the last 10 years, our public information department has had over 129,000 contacts with the public. And as a former employee, I had an opportunity to see the type of people that came and asked for help, and there is no type. There's all economic levels, there's all ethnicities. I hear multiple languages spoken up front because we can request different interpreters from the city, and we have multiple different languages that's spoken in the rent control agency. Landlords, tenants, real estate agents, the press, just numerous people that are just interested. And finally, the public information department also handles the website, and there was last year, or in the last 10 years, we've handled over 875,000 hits on our website, and that's just the rent control portion of the city's website. The final division I want to talk about is hearings, because they also interact with the public a lot. Our hearings officers in that division are all lawyers, and the reason they're all lawyers is because they act as judges in hearings. Those hearings are initiated when there's a dispute between a tenant and a landlord. It can be initiated by either one of those parties. It's initiated by a petition, and that petition can be for various reasons. A tenant could petition to get a rent decrease because of the maintenance issues. They want to get a rent decrease to kind of push the owner to make those maintenance repairs. And an owner can also file one, for example, if they have a tenant that they feel is not actually living in their unit, using it for storage or for office or something like that. So it comes from both sides. And in the last 10 years, there's been over 1,100 petitions filed with the board. And they go through a process where they're initially, petition arrives in our office, remediated if possible. And the majority of are resolved through mediation. Then if it goes to a hearing before a hearing officer, a decision is issued. If they do not like that decision, the owner or the tenant, they can appeal to the rent control board, and then the board itself will meet and decide if there was any errors in the hearing officer's decision. And I know my time is about up. It's got just like 30 seconds more here. And just to let you know my experiences with these types of petitions, I was able to go out into the field and see these real life experiences of tenants living in horrible conditions and just trying to get a petition to get maintenance issues fixed. You'd be surprised how horrible some of these conditions are that they're living in. And I saw construction sites where tenants were living amongst this horrible noise and polluted air and hazardous conditions and just harassment. And I could only imagine how many tenants are not actually petitioning to get things fixed, changed, because they're either afraid of their landlord, afraid of the repercussions, or they just don't understand the rent controls processes. So that kind of gives a brief overlay of the operational side of the Rent Control Board, the agency. I'm not going to specify a lot of the contact information. Just go online, Google, or search for Santa Monica Rent Control and find our website, and you'll get the contact information. But I do want to just let you know that you will get a live person if you call on the telephone. It's going to be a real person to talk to. And if you leave a message on the answering machine after hours or do an email, you're going to get a response the next business day. So thank you very much for my portion. And I believe next up is Erica. And thank you for everybody for listening.
Thank you so much, Lonnie. Great to have you here, and great to have you on the Rent Control Board too.
All right. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you in a month.
See you then. Okay, so next up, we have our Rent Control Board Vice Chair, Erica Leslie, to discuss her lived experiences as a rent control tenant here in Santa Monica. Welcome, Erica.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear what you were saying. I just got my audio to work.
I introduced you and said thanks for coming, and teed you up to start speaking.
Thank you, John. I appreciate that. I guess just to start out, just to share with you guys, as I was running for office to be on the Rent Control Board, I was experiencing housing issues myself. My apartment was flooded. I informed my landlord about exactly what was going on, and my floor looked like a roller coaster. There was hot steam rolling from up under my floorboards, and there was mold growing in my apartment, just to say the least. So I actually needed help myself. So I can clearly empathize with other people that are going through that at the same time. I was also informed of one of our council members going through it at the same time. It's so important that we have our rent control laws in place. As I was out on the campaign trail and I was talking to people, I would speak with grandmothers that were raising their grandchildren and were concerned about the 6% increase and how they were going to be able to feed those grandchildren that they had in their care. Also immigrants that were here within our city borders that were, basically roommate with one another, but were scared to speak to Rent Control Board, even prior to me running for the Rent Control Board, that were just scared and needed help because their rent had gone up 1,000% and not being aware of what their rights were. Rent control is not just for people that are low income. This is for people to stabilize our diversity here in our city. If you knew all the people and the voices that were in need of help, you would truly understand how important this is. The outreach that takes place on a daily basis and the people that our rent control staff interact with on a daily basis are in the hundreds. People that just don't know what exactly to do and they are in need of instruction. That's the reason why the charter states that the Rent Control Board is to stabilize rents to make it equitable so people can age in place. And I'm not saying that verbatim, but this is the importance of what we do here on this Rent Control Board.
Thanks, Erica.
You're welcome.
Okay, so we appreciate you being here, and we'll move on. I believe Kurt is in. Yep. Okay. So next up, we have Rent Control Board Commissioner Kurt Gonska, who'll be looking at the interaction between the Rent Control Board and the city of Santa Monica.
Hey, everybody. Good to join you tonight. Can you all hear me?
Yep.
Okay, cool. So first of all, I just want to thank you, John, and thank the Dem Club for this opportunity for all of us to speak here. a lot of you all probably heard me say this before, whether it was during the endorsement meetings or in other venues, but we here in Santa Monica have a lot of very tenant friendly laws and protections, but they're only as good as they're only good if people know that they have them and they know how to apply them and to actually use them to protect themselves and to deal with any problems that arise. So this is a really useful and important opportunity here to speak to everybody and to help inform you and to help you to know what resources are available when you have issues. Because as we saw this past summer and this past fall, these protections and these laws that we sometimes take for granted can come under fire and can be at risk of being changed, even with people who have good intentions, being changed in a way that aren't benefiting us overall. So I first became sort of exposed to what protections exist and what opportunities in which the rent control office opportunities are provided back when I lived on San Vicente. This was from I lived there from 2014 to 2019, and pretty soon after I moved in, that building was sold to a new owner, which was a corporation. And pretty soon after that, that new owner began doing extensive construction work throughout the building in common areas, also in vacant units that were extremely disruptive and were ongoing for literally years. And so that was, just because I was personally impacted, I, along with a group of neighbors, a pretty sizable group of neighbors, became involved with trying to remedy this problem, all of these problems for the building. And also through that process, we became presented with buyout offers. So pretty quickly, just because of my own personal circumstances, I became well-versed or at least aware of a lot of these things that a lot of people unfortunately have to deal with across the city. And then after I left that location, those issues continued for years with the neighbors who obviously remained there. But in my current apartment, which is also a rent controlled unit near 3rd and Washington, I had a particular issue with my landlord charging pass-through utilities, which is allowable, but the specifics of what was being done at this building turned out to not be allowable. And through that process, I actually first reached out to Anastasia, not knowing her at the time, just knowing that she was a rent control board commissioner. I also reached out to Mike Soloff and actually got those contacts through the SMR helpline. So in that process, we went through with the city, there was mediation, there was a settlement, and more importantly than how I was helped through that process, literally everybody in my building was also helped, because even though it was only a process that I initiated for my own personal circumstances, it was an issue that the outcome applied to everybody. So in a lot of ways, sometimes you can help a lot of other people even by just dealing with something that's impacting you. So, I think one real point I want to emphasize here is that organizations like the Dem Club, like SMR, and entities like the Rent Control Board, those organizations, those entities existing are really important because landlords, well, obviously for a whole bunch of reasons, but in the context of rent control and what we're talking about tonight, really important because landlords typically start off with an advantage. They own the building that we live in. They're usually more familiar with the rules and regulations and how to interact or game the system for their own benefit. And sometimes they do take advantage of the system, or they take advantage of tenants' lack of experience with these issues. Obviously, not all landlords are bad. Many of them, I would say probably even most, follow the rules and just want to run a business and aren't interfering with the regular daily lives of their tenants. But in those situations where that's not the case, we have a lot of protections. We have a lot of opportunities to make sure that you're being treated properly. So when unfortunately things sort of don't go the way that they should, or you're not treated properly in a rent controlled unit, there are a lot of resources for you to take advantage of. So a couple things I want to talk about here for a couple of minutes are the city attorney's office and code enforcement. And so I know that the rent control board and also SMR get a lot of calls about issues that are really tenant harassment issues. And those aren't actually under the purview of the rent control board. So if you start in that, if you start with the rent control board, obviously they'll direct you to the right place. But if they are actually tenant harassment issues, depending on what category the harassment falls under, they can either be dealt with by the city attorney's office or code enforcement. And code enforcement handles harassment cases relating to obviously active code cases, construction issues, relocation, or violation of buyout agreements. And if it doesn't fall into one of those specific categories that code enforcement handles, city attorney's office may be able to step in and help you. But starting with the SMR hotline, starting with the rent control board, reaching out individually to commissioners, those are all ways that we can help direct you, depending on what's going on, to potentially get the help that you need. And there's on the screen, I think previously, and I don't know if it's still up, but there are resources for you. You can also just go to the City of Santa Monica's website to find contact information, phone numbers, email addresses, and a lot of really good information that you can sort of get yourself before you reach out to others for help. Another thing I wanted to touch on tonight was the Ellis Act. And I think probably most of you have heard of it. Some of you are extremely familiar with it, with the ins and outs of it. But just to give a recap, and for those who may not be as aware, the Ellis Act was a state law here in California passed in 1985. And that law gave rental property owners the right to exit the rental housing market. So it could be for things like converting their rental properties to condos. It could be demolishing a building for a completely different type of use. But there are very specific conditions and restrictions in order to qualify to remove tenants underneath the Ellis Act. And a few sort of provisions, just to go through really briefly here, because there's a lot of detail here and a lot of it is very specific to what the landlord's trying to do with the building, who's in the building. And we obviously don't have enough time for all of that today, but just so you sort of understand the basics, underneath the Ellis Act, the landlord must evict all tenants in the building. They can't use it as a way to just remove people who are, substantially under market rate, for example. And then there are also rules about paying permanent relocation benefits to tenants who are removed under the Ellis Act. And that can range anywhere from $17,000 to $35,000, depending on a whole bunch of factors like number of bedrooms, if there are seniors in the units, et cetera. But then there are also very strict rules about what would happen post eviction under the Ellis Act. And that's really the core of what I want to get across here tonight, is that if you have a building on your block, if you have a building that you had friends or family evicted for under the Ellis Act, keeping a watchful eye on those buildings can be really a useful way to flag for the city, for the rent control board, improper activity. Because like I mentioned, most landlords, I would assume most people who use the Ellis Act are legitimate, are following the rules, but there have certainly been documented cases where those rules haven't been followed. And so if a landlord does take a building off the rental market under the Ellis Act, they are not allowed to rent out those units within 5 years, except for under very specific circumstances involving things like the tenants who were evicted having first right to go back into their unit. And regardless of who does go back into those units, very specific rules around what the rent price would be under those units. So it can't be used as a tool to remove people who are paying low rents. It can't be used as a tool to get rid of people paying low rents, bring people in at market rate. So there are very specific rules, and I don't know, Danny may talk in the next section about some of those specifics, but just be aware that there are very specific rules. And if you notice that a building that was Ellis'd has people living in it, whether it's Airbnb, whether it's full, regular tenants, to flag that, because the city doesn't have the resources. The rent control board doesn't always have the resources to be monitoring everything that happens post going through processes like this. And unfortunately, I was looking for more up-to-date data, but I know that as of 2017, the Ellis Act had been used in Santa Monica to withdraw over 3,000 units from the Santa Monica rental market. So it is something that happens regularly. It is something that has, over time, especially, has a significant impact on the housing stock here, on the rent-controlled unit stock here in Santa Monica. And so it's an unfortunate thing when that happens, but when it does happen, at the very least, if we can't stop it, we want to make sure that the rules are followed to a T and that nobody's taking advantage of this, this opportunity in a way that they're not supposed to. And lastly, I know I'm going a little over here on time, but I just want to mention some of the things that passed under Measure RR back in 2010 and how that's been had a positive impact on the community. So Measure RR passed very substantially in 2010, and it extended tenant protection in three major ways. First of all, it extended just cause eviction protections to all tenants in multi-unit apartment buildings. So previously, only controlled units, the just cause requirement only applied to people in controlled units. And so Measure RR means that now applies to all apartments, multi-unit apartment buildings in Santa Monica, meaning that tenancy can only be terminated for a limited, very specific number of reasons when a lease is expired. It also, Measure RR also required landlords to give tenants written notice specifying a reasonable timeframe to correct any alleged lease violations before they can begin an eviction process. And it limits the owner's ability to evict for owner occupancy by forbidding such evictions for tenants who are terminally ill or who have lived in their apartment for at least 5 years and who are disabled or at least 62 years old. So again, there's a lot of details here. Don't expect everyone to remember all of these things, but just trying to give an overview here so that you know there are all kinds of different specific rules and regulations around all of this stuff. So if you are faced with one of these situations or your friends or family are faced with these, there's a lot of good information on the Rent Control Board's website, on the city's website, and then of course all of us can help you as well. So I want to wrap up now, but I wanted to say thank you again. And I look forward to hearing from anybody who ever needs any assistance with any of this stuff, whether it's just a conversation or whether you're ready to move forward in a very specific way. I'm always here for you. You can reach out to me at kurt.gonska@santamonica.gov. So thanks again.
Thanks so much, Kurt. Appreciate you. And last but certainly not least from the Rent Control Board, we have somebody very familiar to this club, Rent Control Board Commissioner Danny Ivanov, who's also served for the past year as the Santa Monica Democratic Club Vice President of Political Action. Danny will be addressing the legal issues and case law surrounding rent control laws here in California. Welcome, Danny.
Hi, everyone. So I'll be addressing the legal landscape of rent control. Specifically, I'm going to touch on case law outlining the constitutionality of rent control. I'm going to talk about the leasing ordinance that banned furnished corporate rentals of less than 1 year. I'm going to very briefly touch on the Airbnb case, and then I'm going to end with what's called the RUBS billing case. So there's a ton of case law that pertains to rent control, and we can talk about it for hours, but obviously in the short amount of time that I have allotted here, I picked a few cases that I thought were the most important for everybody to know. So the seminal case that pertains to the constitutionality of rent control here in California statewide is the Birkenfeld decision. And so every city has something called the police power, which comes from the California Constitution. When I say police power, I'm not talking about the police department or what we might think of when we hear that word. The police power refers to every city has an authority to regulate on behalf of the general welfare, public health, public safety. And so what the Birkenfeld court said is that regulating residential rents and then putting in place restrictions on evicting tenants in support of those limitations on rent falls within a city's police power, which again comes from the California Constitution. So that's the seminal case in California that shows that rent control here statewide passes constitutional muster. Another case that I want to touch on is, that case, the Birkenfeld case, by the way, was decided in 1976, just for everyone's context. The next case I want to discuss, the Penn Central Transportation versus New York City case. This was decided in 1978. So in the federal constitution, there's something called the Takings Clause. And the Takings Clause says that no private property can be taken for public use without just compensation. And the Penn Central decision essentially does a takings analysis. It goes through all the factors of what constitutes public use, what constitutes just compensation. The reason why I want to mention this case to you all is because in recent years, I would say within the last 2, 3, 4 years, we've seen a national trend of landlord associations across the country filing suits against their local rent control laws in their jurisdictions. And what their argument up to this point has been is that the rent control laws in their jurisdiction place such a restriction on their ability to raise rent and evict their tenants that it amounts to a seizure of their property and thus a taking without just compensation. Now, up to this point, this argument has failed. This argument has not have won anywhere yet. The most recent case similar to the most recent decision outlining this issue was in New York State, and where the local landlord association there filed suit challenging New York City's rent control law. The district court ruled in favor, upheld the city's rent control law. The Second Circuit Court of Appeals upheld that decision. I think everybody on this call will be very happy and proud to know that our general counsel on the rent control board, in coordination with the Santa Monica City's Attorney's Office, actually filed an amicus brief in support of the city in that case, which obviously led to the favorable ruling. Again, the reason why I wanted to touch on this case is we think the reason why this national trend has occurred is because we think these landlord associations nationwide think that they now have a favorable Supreme Court that might be potentially amenable to their line of argument. So even though it hasn't worked thus far, I want to put this on people's radar because unfortunately it's a very cynical viewpoint of our legal system. But I think what these landlord associations are doing up to this point is they're saying, we might lose at the district court level, we might even lose at the appellate court level, but if we just get this up to the Supreme Court, we might find some justices that are sympathetic to our line of argument and we might prevail there. So this is just something to keep an eye on in the near future, in the years to come. The last case that I want to touch on is Creighton versus City of Santa Monica, decided in 1984. And this has to do with our local rent control law and our rent control board here in Santa Monica. So in this case, the autonomy of the rent control board itself was challenged. And first, what this court did is it reiterated the argument in Birkenfeld, which said that rent control is something that falls within a city's police power. But then what it also said is because the Santa Monica Rent Control is a rulemaking and adjudicatory body, because its decisions are judicially reviewable, and because it has the authority to raise fees to cover its own expenses, voters intended for the rent control board, not the city council, to have control over its own budget and to hire staff in support of its own autonomy. And what the court said is just because the city council passes ordinances to effectuate the rent control charter, that's just implementing voter intent. That's not something that arises to an unconstitutional delegation of authority. So the main takeaway, if you take away one thing from this entire presentation, the one thing that I want people to understand is that rent control sits on sound legal footing. Rent control is battle tested, if you will. Rent control is not something that operates at the whims of any political group or whoever's in in power at the time. So rent control rests on solid legal footing. Now, I want to address the leasing ordinance that banned furnished corporate rentals of less than 1 year. So Santa Monica Municipal Code 6.22.060 says that a lease must be in writing and it must be for at least a term of 1 year. Municipal Code Section 6.22.070 says that any rental housing must be unfurnished. Now, I want to provide some context as to what led the city to pass these regulations. So in late 2020, when the city council was taking up this issue, short-term vacation rentals of less than 30 days were already strictly regulated and banned by the council. But medium-term rentals, which are defined as leases that range from anywhere between 31 and 365 days, were not only unregulated, they were not even defined in the municipal code. But the city council was observing that there was a growing practice of medium-term rentals. And because typically the monthly price point of medium-term rentals is higher than annual leases, landlords were incentivized in offering medium-term rentals. And a lot of studies have actually shown that medium-term rentals hurt both the affordability and the supply of a city's permanent housing stock. And the other issue with medium-term rentals is that it creates a very high turnover in tenancy, which hurts the stability of a neighborhood. Now, in the summer of 2021, NMS entities actually filed suit alleging that Municipal Code Section 6.22 violates the state constitution. And this is actually an issue that is still ongoing. So this is actually still pending litigation that the city is involved in. Very briefly on the Airbnb matter, as I mentioned earlier, short-term vacation rentals of less than 30 days were already strictly regulated and banned. Airbnb filed suit challenging this ban on short-term rentals. And in 2019, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals upheld the ban. And so the city prevailed in that matter. Last issue I want to touch on is something called the RUBS billing case. And this issue was decided in 2019 and 2020. For those of you who don't know, RUBS stands for Ratio Utility Billing Systems. And landlords that engage in RUBS means that they weren't charging tenants for how much they actually used a certain utility. What they did was they took a master metered utility like water, and they would take the monthly total and they would divide the price by the number of units in that building. And then they would pass on that price to the tenants. So what happened was tenants were not paying for how much they were using a certain utility. And so it created these wild fluctuations where, in the case of water, for example, there were situations where, 1 month tenants were paying $50 for the water bill, and then the next month they were paying $400 for a water bill. So what this court in the RUBS billing matter did was very important. What the RUBS court said was that utilities are part of the rent to the extent that they are paid by the landlord, obviously. And so when deciding that utilities are part of the rent, what that means is that utilities are also subject to the same limits on rent increases under the rent control law. So now any effort by landlords to charge varying amounts for utilities based on master metered utilities or those that are used by a property as a whole would run afoul of excess rent prohibitions. And so because of this case, tenants now have a remedy where if landlords do engage in this behavior, they can file in something called an excess rent petition to recover those charges. So that's all that I had for you. I hope everybody found this presentation to be informative and hopefully learned something new. So thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thanks so much, Danny. Glad to have you on the rent control board. We'll miss you on our executive board here. Okay, and now to wrap up the rent control board's portion of this presentation, let's welcome back to the meeting Chair Anastasia Foster.
Hey, I'm back. What did I miss? Just kidding. Just kidding. I hope everybody learned a lot. Even some of you who might have thought you know everything there is to know about Santa Monica rent control. Maybe you were reminded of some things you'd forgotten or picked up some new tips for a neighbor if you're a homeowner. I'll never forget, I was campaigning one time and I walked up to a table at Starbucks and there were about 8, I'll say slightly older adults sitting around the table. And I said, hey, I'm running for office for rent board. And can I talk to you guys a little bit? They went, oh, no, we're homeowners. We don't, it's fine, honey. We don't need to. And this lady smacked the guy in the arm and said, did you forget about me? And the other 7 went, oh my gosh, that's right. You know, she rents. And then they sat there and listened to me, you know, for 10, 15 minutes. And they were fascinated to learn some of the things that you learned here today. Renters are human beings and community members, just like you, just like me. I ran for office. I'm in my 2nd rent control department. I can't afford to buy here. I am one of those 70% front door keys that opens an apartment. I'm raising my son in our public schools, and I'm really proud of this community. I've put down my roots here, and I'm 1 year away from living here longer than my parents' home. So that makes it home. Anything more than 12 months makes it home, according to our laws. So we really hope you enjoyed this presentation. It was meant to be informational, and we hope you found it so. You saw lots of contact information for all of us, for the agencies, for the various city offices. And just know that, you know, if other questions come down the road, we've got this presentation ready to go and ready with great data and facts to support rent control in Santa Monica and to illuminate and educate. And thank you so much. We thank you for listening and for attending.
Thank you so much, Anastasia, Chair Foster. And thank you to all the rent control board members who came through this evening to speak about the rent control law from a policy perspective. And now we have a couple more speakers to hear from who'll be discussing the history of community engagement on rent control. And first up to discuss the history and origins of Santa Monica's rent control law, let's welcome former Santa Monica Mayor and current co-chair of Santa Monicans for Renters' Rights, Denny Zane.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much. Hey, all. It's good of you to be here tonight, learning so much. I really thought the presentations have been excellent. Annie, I thought your overview of legal cases was very effective. I have one thing, though, I want to add on legal cases before I get into the history, because it has bearing on recent matters. The Birkenfeld case, Danny correctly describes it as basically ruling that rent control was a legitimate function of local government. It placed a constraint, an important constraint on rent control laws. The Berkeley law that they were ruling on at the time did not have an annual adjustment. It only had unit by unit adjudication of any claims for rent increases for landlords. And the court ruled that was an unlawful taking, that the procedure would be so onerous for all the landlords have to get in line and each one seek a rent increase each year. And they overturned the rent control law as procedurally unconstitutional. And so out of that came practice that all rent control laws now share, which is the practice of having an annual adjustment each year rather than one by one. Although landlords who still think they have, they're not getting a fair return can appeal. And I raise that to you now because it is precisely that provision, the proposal that came before the council heading into the last election, where some council members wanted to freeze rents for half the population for 4 years and give the other half 6% increase each year for 4 years. I thought that was such a smart idea. However, freezing the rent for tenants that way for 1 year, much less 4 years, would have been a violation of Birkenfeld and would have given them landlords what they would have wanted, an opportunity to overturn the whole law. That was the big flaw in what other council members tried to offer. So let's go now to the history. And I regret to tell you that there are only a few of us here remaining that were activists in that history. I was one. And it begins really in about early 1977. And it's a moment when property values and rents are starting to really go up. And on the property value side, that was triggering property tax increases. And that led to an effort by the landlords or the apartment owners association statewide to put Prop 13 on the ballot, frankly, to take advantage of what was happening in property taxes. At the same time, rents were going up, and Berkeley had a rent control law I just mentioned to you that had been enacted in '76 that was overturned with the Birkenfeld case. And then we had a rent control law on the ballot in June of 1978. Now, what happened then was a group of about a dozen senior citizens really spearheaded the creation of that rent control law. We're activists, organizations and things around Santa Monica and our neighboring communities. Tom Hayden had ran for Senate. There was a activist organization called CED that was in the community then, but was not part of the originally of the origins of the rent control law. It was a group of seniors. And they worked with Bob Myers, who later became city attorney, a brilliant and very dedicated to tenants attorney from Legal Aid Foundation. And he helped them write their rent control law. And that group of seniors went out there and got all the signatures needed to qualify for the 1978 election. But they were having trouble with their leadership in the organization, getting the leadership there to raise money and try to actually run a campaign. So they came to those of us who were in CED, Tom Hayden's organization, Tom and Jane Fonda's organization, and asked us for help. And I volunteered, and a guy named Park Skelton, many of you may have heard of or know, also volunteered, and we began to become people working with this group of seniors. As we got closer to the June 78 election, it was clearer and clearer that the original organization who had done the petition drive wasn't going to do much for a campaign. And so we formed our own organization, then called Santa Monica Fair Housing Alliance, and it became the vehicle in the last month and a half for that campaign. The Democratic Club was an active endorser of the campaign, but they were trying to respect the leadership of the original renters rent control initiative group. So there wasn't a cohesive, really effective coalition that was created. Santa Monica Fair Housing Alliance did a good job. We did a good job, I think, given how little we had and the time that was remaining. And we narrowly lost in June 1978. But what it really showed us was that we could win if we did things right. And so we began after June of 1978, begin to form a coalition. Santa Monica Fair Housing Alliance and CED were key parts of that coalition, and so was the Democratic Club. And there were organizations, for example, in Ocean Park and the Pico neighborhood that also became part of that coalition. That coalition became Santa Monicans for Renters' Rights. And originally, the rules were every decision had to be unanimous. Any one of those organizations could veto something about any decision. That coalition then began to launch another signature drive with a somewhat modified measure to qualify it for the April 1979 elections. Now, in those days, city elections were in April of odd-numbered years. But the state and the federal government still had June and November primary and general elections. So we would frequently, we were constantly having elections, it seemed, with those 3 months in the opportunity. And in that April 1979 election, we also made a decision we would try to run our first city council candidates. And again, this was a coalition, and the Democratic Club was a key part of that coalition, and it had a veto like anybody else did. And we came to agreement about a couple of candidates, as well as its revised rent control law. We launched the campaign. Most of our fundraising, this is sort of funny, but most of our fundraising is done at the church in Ocean Park, where we would have these monthly parties, dances. We called it the boogie strategy, because we would use old rock and roll tapes, that most of which I had recorded, and speakers up on the balconies, and several hundred people would come to our events, and I don't know whether it was $15 or $20, and have a great time, party, and we raised money. In the first campaign that we lost, we had raised about $10,000. In the campaign that we won, we raised almost $50,000, almost all of it from the boogie strategy. And we elected ultimately, not only in 1979 did we elect as the rent control law, we elected 2 city council members, Ruth Unata Goldway and a guy named Bill Jennings. And from there forward, we increasingly became the majority voice in the city of Santa Monica. I would like to point out, though, that one of the things that happened is that SMER evolved from being a coalition of multiple organizations to become an organization itself, with a convention to elect its officers and a convention to appoint, to endorse various candidates. And of the other organizations that had their separate existences then, the only one that really continued alongside of SMER have a separate and independent existence was the Democratic Club. And the Democratic Club and SMER have been kind of like partners in what I would call a progressive ballet for all that time until now. And together we have had extraordinary successes that we probably would not have if there weren't both of us in this community. I want to thank all of you who have been activists in the Democratic Club. I think your influence in the last election was profound. And as a co-chair of SMER, I know that we always look to the Democratic Club as our co-equal partners in local politics here in Santa Monica. That's it.
Thanks so much, Denny. Appreciate you and everything you've done for this city for rent control. Okay, so our final speaker tonight is Michael Soloff, who, as everyone here knows, has also served on the executive committee of this club for nearly a decade. He's a former chair of the Santa Monica Housing Commission and is also the current co-chair of SMER. He'll be discussing the history of this club and how we've used the issue of rent control more recently as a lens through which we've taken direct action, as well as considered candidates for endorsement. Mike?
Thanks, John. I think our rent control members did an excellent job tonight of explaining the critical role that rent control plays both in the day-to-day lives of so many of our neighbors and in maintaining an economically diverse Santa Monica that I think all of us value and enjoy. And Denny just did an excellent job of explaining what it took to win rent control in the first place and the critical role this club has played in that political fight. But I just want to point out that the maintenance of rent control is not just a matter of Santa Monica history. Rather, as the events of the last year demonstrate, the maintenance of rent control is very much a current issue for this club and for this community. Now, the club has, of course, always taken care to endorse and work to elect high-quality candidates to the Rent Control Board who are committed to enforcing fairly the existing rent control laws. And the club has also taken care to endorse and work to elect city council candidates who are committed to the preservation of rent control. For example, the club endorsed city council members are the people who passed that measure, or that law, I should say, that Danny was telling you about, that assures that our rent controlled units are not converted into medium-term corporate rentals, but instead remain as units to serve real human beings who want to make Santa Monica as their primary residence. Now, last year, with the onset of the historically high inflation, rent controlled tenants were threatened for the first time with up to 6% rent increases, and it would have been 6% if nothing had happened. Then there was a meeting of activists, including several rent control board members, at which Denny actually is the one who suggested lowering the cap on the annual rents. And this ultimately led to the proposed measure RC, which the rent control board asked the city council to place on the ballot. And as was explained, that would lower the cap to 3% and make some adjustments so that last year would be 3%, even though we couldn't make the change until the November election. Now that proposal from the rent control board came to the city council because only the city council is able to place a ballot measure, which would be needed to change the charter where the rent control law is, onto the November ballot. And that was on July 26th. As many of you or some of you know, council meetings can go very late, and this item didn't come up until after 1 a.m. And I was actually there at the time. I remember that. At that time, Councilmember Negrete raised for the first time an alternative proposal that would have provided no relief from the 6% rent increases to tenants who were paying in the top 50% of rent control rents. But as I think Denny mentioned, would preclude for 4 years any rent increase at all for rent controlled tenants paying the bottom 50% of rents. This had not been disclosed publicly prior to this meeting. There had not been any consultation with the rent control board about this proposal. That then led in the wee hours of the morning to a pretty heated debate at the city council, including comments from the rent control board general counsel, who expressed concern regarding the legality of that alternative proposal for the reasons that Denny explained at the beginning of his remarks. And the 3 city council members who this club had previously endorsed indicated they did not support that alternative. They wanted the original rent control board endorsed proposal. They decided then in the very wee hours of the morning that they would have a special meeting on August 3rd in order to consider this further. So immediately following that, the board of this club voted to support the original proposal put forward by the rent control board, and the club membership voted to support that same proposal at our regular July 28th membership meeting. And this reflected the concern that all tenants needed relief against the 6% rent increases, and that any fundamental changes to the rent control law must be studied carefully, vetted with experts at the rent control board, and discussed with the community before the city council, would take such changes to the voters. With that endorsement by the club membership itself, the exec then worked to organize a rally at City Hall with all allied groups in support of that original proposal, what eventually became Measure RC, that was going to be held the day before the special meeting. Councilmember Negrete, then aware of the concerns of this club and many others in the community, announced that she would be withdrawing her alternative proposal. But we did go forward with the rally in support of the original proposal, what became Measure RC, on August 2nd. The next day, the city council met. Council members Brock and Parra moved to support the original proposal, but they wanted it to sunset, that is end, after 4 years, so that after 4 years, it could go back to, there could be up to a 6% rent increase. Councilmember Negrete at that meeting indicated she wouldn't support that sunset, at which point it was clear that the motion would not pass because, again, the 3 council members this club had endorsed did not support a sunset, and the motion wasn't withdrawn. Council then voted unanimously to place the original proposal on the ballot. That's what became Measure RC. And the council also voted unanimously that there would be a study session sometime this year, 2023, about rent control and whether any changes should be considered to be proposed to the voters in a future election. The membership of this club then, using our normal process where we hear from both sides, voted to endorse Measure RC, which then passed overwhelmingly in November with almost 59% of the vote. So I recite this brief history to you so that you hopefully take away two important points. First, rent control is not just a historical issue, but it's a live issue right now in the city. At some point this year, City Council is likely to consider potential changes to the rent control law. And secondly, your voices and the voice of this club are going to matter a lot to that discussion. I think it's fair to say that the voice of this club, the voice of SMER, and the voice of other allied organizations led to the withdrawal of the alternative proposal, to the withdrawal of the proposal to sunset Measure RC, and therefore to the passage of a law that protects all rent control tenants from what otherwise would have been a 6% rent increase last year, and unfortunately next year as well, given the persistence of inflation. Now, of course, when council begins to discuss possible changes, we'll keep the membership informed and we'll consider any individual proposals on their merits. But I hope that with the background you received tonight, you will understand why it's important, and you will join us in the next chapter of considerations of how best to protect renters in the city of Santa Monica.
Okay, thank you so much, Mike, and also to Denny for providing that context, the historical context, the more recent present day context, to show how, after hearing from the Rent Control Board about what the actual rent control law does, that there's a real history going back almost 50 years now about how this came to be and how it's still very much a current political issue that we still need to be thinking about. Okay, so that's a wrap on our presentation of Rent Control 101. I want to thank all of our presenters for joining us this evening. We hope everyone found the meeting to be informative and you've learned a lot about Santa Monica rent control. And as I said at the beginning, we're not taking any questions and doing a back and forth right now. But if we do need to take direct action or an endorsement position pertaining to rent control in the future, we will agendize a discussion or debate meeting format to consider those actions before moving forward. Before we go, I also wanted to remind everybody that it is Black History Month, and our Diversity and Inclusion Committee, led by Raina Kirkland, had a very good meeting earlier this month where former Mayor Nat Travis spoke about his experiences as the first African-American mayor of Santa Monica. If you're watching this live with us here in the Zoom meeting, I recommend you go to the YouTube account of the club. And if you're watching this on YouTube, just scroll down a bit. It's the next video below this one about the history, I believe it just says former Mayor Nat Travis. It's a very interesting 20-minute presentation from Nat about his experiences. Remember, the next meeting of this club is March 29th, our club's legislative agenda for 2023, as well as the annual executive committee election. See you then, and we adjourn tonight in honor of the great Burt Bacharach.
Lord, we don't need another mountain. There are mountains and hillsides enough to climb. There are oceans and rivers enough to last till the end of time. The world needs now is that sweet love. It's the only thing that the just too little love. The world needs now is love, sweet love. Those that just put sorrow over just for
Thank you, everybody. God bless you. God bless America.